each of the following tends to follow a 7-day cycle. The rejection of organ transplants. If somebody has an organ transplant and they do well for the first 6 days and you get them by the 7th day, they tend to do well. Your immune system's response to infection runs on a 7-day cycle. Your blood and your urine chemicals run on a 7-day cycle. Your blood pressure re-evaluates or regulates on a 7-day cycle. Your heartbeat goes on a 7-day cycle. Common cold often goes through a 7-day cycle. Coping hormones, particularly in females, go on a 7-day cycle and they redo, which is really a fascinating study, a hormonal study that's being done. So there are clocks. There are biological clocks in your body. Now, if you violate this, and if you look back at the history, particularly 20th century history, and 19th and 20th century history, you see some nations that I'll show you that have violated this. Here's what God says in Deuteronomy 5, verse 23. You shall walk in all the ways which the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live and that it may be well with you. So the Sabbath principle is not some legalistic requirement that you can't do this, you can't do that. It's a loving invitation from God to live in harmony with the laws of our being and to live in harmony with the way He's made us, the way our bodies are programmed, to rest in Him, to receive the blessing and the sanctification. And it says that it may be well with you, that you may prolong your days in the land which you shall possess. So the Sabbath, then, is a stoplight on the road of life that invites us to the sanctuary of God, where we find His refuge and care. Now, in the French Revolution, the French in 1790s understood this. See, look at all the elements of time. A day. How long is a day? A day is how long? It's the amount of time the earth rotates on its what? Axis. There are 4 basic elements of time. The day, the week, the month, the year, right? Those are the 4 basic elements of time. You see, an hour is a 24th of a day. So there's the day. That's the amount of time that the earth rotates on its axis. That's governed by astronomy. How long's a month? What's a month?
30 days.
Roughly 30 days, but how do you calculate a month? The amount of time, what? The moon goes around the earth, right? So that's a month. How much is a year? The amount of time that the earth rotates around the sun. That's 365 1/4 days. So a day, a week, a month, and a year are all calculated by astronomy. Now, how long's a week? Why is a week 7 days? Who came up with the idea that the week was 7 days?
God.
It's not based on astronomy at all. It's based on the creation narrative, see. Now, in the French Revolution, they understood this. So it's the age of reason. So the French said, look, if we have the 7-day week, we have to get rid of every vestige of God. We've got to get rid of every inclination of God. And if you accept the 7-day weekly cycle, you accept God as creator. Because that is the only explanation of Genesis for the weekly cycle. So the French said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to make a 10-day week. And here it is. A new secular, rational week of 10 days was devised and approved by the ruling convention in October 1793, because they want to get rid of every vestige of God. And here's what happens. You work 9 days, you rest the 10th. You work 9 days, you rest the 10th. People are experiencing nervous breakdowns. They're experiencing depression. The animals refuse to work. And after 3.5 years, the French have to change it. So Stalin comes along, and he says, I got a brilliant idea. We'll keep the Russians working all the time, but what's going to happen is they'll work 4 days and rest the 5th. Work 4 and rest the 5th. He tries it. He tries the experiment for 11 years. And this is what happens. After 11 years of disappointing production and epidemic irresponsibility in the workplace, 1929 to 1940, Stalin calls it quits, and he gives the Soviet people back their 7-day week. But why did the French try it? Why did the Russians try it? The reason they tried it is one reason: to get rid of that whole reminder of God as creator. Throughout both the Old and New Testaments, we find the significance of the Sabbath. You come to the 10 Commandment law, and the 10 Commandment law refers back to creation. God wrote the 10 Commandments with His own finger on tables of stone. Do you think that anything that God writes with His own finger is pretty important? Amen. You think that's important? Amen. I mean, if God writes it with His own finger, if it's the only thing He writes in the whole Bible with His own finger as a law, He doesn't write it on sand to be washed away. Doesn't write it on parchment to be burned away, but he writes it with his own finger. And what does God say in one of those commandments? God wrote the law to endure forever. You know, I've had people say, well, the law was nailed to the cross. You know what I always ask them? Tell me which commandments. Was the one thou shalt not steal? Was the one that thou shalt not kill? So after the cross we can kill, steal, commit adultery. They say no. What about the one that says thou shalt have no other gods before me? Was that nailed to the cross? No. You see, you don't nail 10 commandments to the cross, but take 9 back. You see, God wrote the law to endure forever. And I wonder, God must have known, what does he start the Sabbath commandment with? What does he start it with? Remember the Sabbath day to do what? Keep it holy. Why did God say remember? He knew mankind would forget. He knew in the busy rush of life that we would tend to forget. So he calls us back to remember the Sabbath, not as some legalistic requirement, but rather as a sign